The second approach is one that I consider negative. For my first approach, I begin with the Talmud. As many of you in this audience know, the Talmud is the most authoritative traditional explanation of the Bible and of halakha, or Jewish religious law. Talmudic references are many, that the happiness of a community, local or global, can only be answered when it rests upon a foundation of peace. In one Talmudic reference, the following appears: by three things is the world preserved: by truth, by judgment, and by peace. Another Talmudic reference put it this way: in the absence of peace, there can be neither prosperity nor well-being. And in another place, peace is equal in worth to everything. Great praise is bestowed on the peacemaker. An apocryphal legend in rabbinical literature that I especially like is, a rabbi was standing in a marketplace when the prophet Elijah appeared to him. The rabbi asked him, "Is there anyone in this marketplace who will have a share in the world to come?" Elijah answered that there were not. In the meanwhile, there came two men, and Elijah said, "These two will have a share in the world to come." The rabbi then asked the two men, "What is your occupation?" They answered, "We are merrymakers. When we see men troubled in mind, we cheer them, and when we see two men quarreling, we make peace between them." Rabbi Hillel was one of the great Jewish sages. One of his favorite maxims, often cited in traditional rabbinic literature, was, "Be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace." The Talmud indicates as well what is essential for the maintenance of peace and what is apt to destroy it. Justice is here combined with peace. One Talmudic saying is, "The sword comes into the world for the delay of justice and for the perversion of justice, and on account of the offense of those who interpret the Torah, God's word, not according to its true sense." Another saying, "By three things is the world preserved: by truth, by judgment, and by peace. The three are realized if judgment is executed, truth is vindicated, and peace results." The rabbis at the beginning of the Talmudic period, that is, towards the end of the first century of the Common Era, were keen to point out that justice was greatly superior to any offerings in the temple. Sacrifices, they said, only atoned for a person who sinned in error, but righteousness and justice atone for him who sins either in error or intentionally. They also insisted that God declared that righteous and justice human beings, their performance was dearer than the temple. For the rabbis, righteousness was the one pillar upon which the earth stood. They often cited Proverbs chapter 10, verse 25, "The righteous is the foundation of the world." All of this is repeated in prayers today during the annual High Holy Days. The rabbis repeatedly insisted upon righteousness and justice being the key items in the governing of the state. They also emphasized that the administration of justice, the administrators of justice, that is to say judges, bore a heavy responsibility since the fate of the entire community depended upon them. In this regard, it was maintained that injustice could ruin the community. The qualifications of a judge were set very high, and the strictest impartiality was required. The rabbis were also keen at times to protect the rights of a Gentile, and said that whenever a Gentile was brought to a Jewish court with charges pending against him, the Gentile had the right to choose whether to be tried under the Jewish law or under the law of Gentile society. The example of judges and justice is in current Jewish literature, and it has been expanded as a guide to what should prevail globally. Wherever there is justice, there is peace, and wherever there is peace, there is justice. As one dictate upon biblical sources puts it, "Great is peace, because peace is for the earth, what yeast is for the dough. If the Holy One, blessed be he, had not given peace to the earth, it would be depopulated by the sword and by hosts of animals. The world rests upon three things: on justice, on truth, on peace. Yet those three are the one and the same things. For if there is justice, there is truth, and there is peace. And these three are expressed in one and the same verse. Execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates. Wherever there is justice, there is peace, and wherever there is peace, there is justice. The second approach, which I consider negative, is both specific and current. It is from the opposite end of the spectrum from the first approach. It is a part of Jewish fundamentalism. The Messianic fundamentalist Jews are in many ways the most influential of all fundamentalist Jews. They oppose equality of Jews and non-Jews, and they harbor contempt for non-Jews. Rabbi Kook the Elder, the revered father of the Messianic Jewish fundamentalists, wrote, "The difference between a Jewish soul and souls of non-Jews, all of them in all different levels, is greater and deeper than the difference between a human soul and the souls of cattle." Rabbi Kook's entire teaching, followed devoutly by among others, including those who have led the religious settlers in the occupied West Bank, is based upon the Lurianic Kabbalah, the school of Jewish mysticism that dominated Judaism from the late 16th to the early 19th century. One of the basic tenets of the Lurianic Kabbalah is the absolute superiority of the Jewish soul and body over the non-Jewish soul and body. According to the Lurianic Kabbalah, the world was created solely for the sake of Jews. The existence of non-Jews was subsidiary. According to this ideology, which is followed by among others, by the Messianic militant West Bank settlers and most Hasidic Jews, non-Jews have satanic souls. There is an inherent hatred here of Western culture with its national democratic elements. This ideology is both eschatological and messianic. It assumes the imminent coming of the Messiah and asserts that the Jews, aided by God, will thereafter triumph over the non-Jews and rule them forever. The religious law believed in and advocated by these fundamentalists then differentiates between Jews and non-Jews. The late, highly revered Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who headed the Chabad Hasidic movement and wielded great influence in Israel as well as the United States, explained that Jews and non-Jews needed to be differentiated from one another because they are, I'm quoting him, certainly within context, totally different species. He wrote, I'm quoting, "A non-Jew's total reality is only vanity. The entire creation of a non-Jew exists only for the sake of Jews." Rabbi Schneerson always supported wars by the state of Israel and opposed any retreat. In the 1970s, he strongly opposed the Israeli withdrawal from the Suez area. He promised Israel divine favors if it persisted in occupying the land taken in the 1967 war. The Chabad Hasids, who follow Schneerson's teachings, are one of Israel's most extreme groups. Baruch Goldstein, the mass murderer of Palestinians a few years ago, was one of them. Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who praised the murders committed by Goldstein, is a typical member of the above group. He has alleged openly the Jews' genetic-based spiritual superiority over non-Jews, as he has asserted. Ginsburg has asserted, I'm quoting him, "If every simple cell in a Jewish body entails divinity, is a part of God, then every strand of DNA is part of God. Therefore, something is special about Jewish DNA." The threat to peace and justice in Israel-Palestine, as well as to global peace and justice, is clearly indicated by these Jewish fundamentalists. These fundamentalists, who have opposed any and all Israeli withdrawals from territories conquered and occupied by Israel since 1967, even withdrawal, as I've already mentioned, from the Sinai in 1978 after the Camp David Agreement, include leaders of the National Religious Party in Israel and the Gush Emunim, Bloc of the Faithful, West Bank Jewish settlers, for example. Members of the Gush Emunim argue typically that what appears to outsiders to be confiscation of Arab-owned land for subsequent settlements by Jews is in reality not stealing, but rather sanctification. From their perspective, the land is transferred from the satanic to the divine sphere. They and other Jewish fundamentalists believe that God gave all the land of Israel to the Jews and that Arabs living there are thieves. Rabbi Israel Ariel, a fundamentalist leader, has published an atlas, as have a good many other of these rabbis, designated as Jewish all land west and south of the Euphrates River, extending through most of Syria, much of Iraq, and present-day Kuwait. Rabbi Shlomo Avner, another spokesperson, has declared, "We must live in this land, even at the price of war. Moreover, if there is peace, we must instigate wars of liberation in order to conquer it," the land. Rabbi Eliezer Waldman, another major Gush Emunim leader, who is additionally the head of a major religious school in the Jewish settlement of Kiryat Arba in the West Bank, explained in a June 2002 speech that he delivered to a large gathering of Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, New York. He declared this, I'm quoting him, "The unique attachment of the children of Israel to the land of Israel cannot be compared to the ties of any nation to its land. Our attachment originates in the divine plan of the creation of heaven and earth. Let us say clearly and strongly, we are not occupying foreign territories in Judea and Samaria, that is to say the West Bank. This is our ancient home, and thank God we have brought it back to life. Unfortunately, some of our ancient towns are still illegally occupied by foreigners, interfering with the divine process of the redemption of Israel." Now, the most recent years have witnessed a dramatic growth of Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, which manifested itself in the 1990s as a vigorous opposition to any reasonable proposal for negotiating a peace with the Palestinians. Here is clearly a threat to global peace and justice. Be assured that this Jewish fundamentalist position is not dominant in Judaism, nor among Jews today. The majority of Jews oppose it. Unfortunately, as I've just indicated, however, it is growing in importance and certainly qualifies, I think unfortunately, as one Judaic and Jewish approach to global peace and justice. Finally, I come to my final point, which I have labeled a Jewish approach as opposed to a Judaic religious approach. Please keep in mind that what I shall briefly mention here is but one of many and varied Jewish approaches. There is not, as some people assert, one and only one Jewish approach. This approach is the Zionist approach, which pragmatically, for over 55 years of that state's total existence, has been the Israeli approach. The fundamentalist Judaic approach I previously mentioned, in some ways, is one part of this Zionist approach to global peace and justice, but does not constitute Zionism's primary essence. The primary essence is secular, and as such, there is opposition to it on many grounds by fundamentalists and other religious Jews. I would argue further, if time permitted, that Zionism is antithetical to the most positive expressions of Judaism. I was not surprised by a recent Eurobarometer poll that showed 59% of Europeans questioned saw Israel as the greatest threat to global peace. That is an exaggeration, in my opinion. It is not an anti-Semitic charge, as some people have argued, but it does relate to this approach of Zionism, which constitutes the character of the state of Israel. That state, because of its Zionist character, grants rights and privileges to Jews not granted to non-Jews, even those non-Jews who are citizens of the state, and that state also, because of its Zionist character, oppresses the indigenous Palestinian population in order to maintain its Zionist, demographically Jewish structure. Here we have the heart center of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has not only threatened, but has been a hindrance and at times a violent obstacle to peace in the Middle East and has threatened global peace in numerous ways. That the government of the United States has so supported politically, militarily, and economically the stance and actions of the Zionist state of Israel has clearly raised the level of this threat to global peace and justice. I shall discuss much of what I have here briefly mentioned in my lecture on Israel, the United States, and the Arab-Israeli conflict tomorrow afternoon. I apologize if I took a bit more time to speak than was allotted to me for my opening remarks. Some professors, of which I am one, seem to talk quite a bit. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
I think we open the floor for discussion. We have 30 minutes at our disposal, 25 minutes exactly. And if those who want to make a comment are more in number, then we will limit the time. Otherwise, if the speakers are less in number, then I hope we can have a clear discussion. May I go? Who would like to comment?
I think it was a very illuminating presentation. But may I ask, what is the way out? The Jewish way out?
A rather difficult question to answer, right? The only way out is obviously to have a change away from the negative and towards the positive. Now, I will suggest that this way out, you ask the Jewish way out, may not be so very much dissimilar from a similar question that might be asked of Islam in terms of certain groupings within Islam who I would classify in the fundamentalist position of advocating similar things, let us say for an Islamic state, if that would ever come into existence, as the Zionists advocate for a Jewish state. So just as I've said that the emphasis has to be upon the positive in Judaism, so I would suggest is the same case for Islam. But to go even a bit further than that, I'd like to point out that everything is not so bleak as it might appear from even the balance of my talk, where I talked about two approaches that were a negative and only one approach, the beginning one, which was positive. I say that should not necessarily indicate that things are so bleak. Why? Well, because I only had time to talk about three approaches. There are others. And secondly, because, as I'm sure many of you know, a growing number, still a minority, of course, but a growing number of Israeli Jews, as well as Jews in other parts of the world, a growing number of those people are people who are beginning to react or expanding their reaction against these negative elements about which I have spoken. It's true that at the same time, fundamentalism is also growing within Israel. Might then the growth of the fundamentalists on the one hand who advocate the kinds of things that I spoke about today, and a growth in those who oppose that terribly, might that not lead then to internal Jewish conflict within Israel? The answer to that is it may lead to conflict within Israel. I hope that it's not going to be violent conflict, but if that conflict means that the positive wins out, then I would say that, the end result may well be a good one. Thank you.
Yeah.
As a Palestinian, of course, can you please mention your good name?
Yes, my name is Ibrahim Azharani from England. As a Palestinian, I cannot come to the defense of Zionism, but Zionism is extremely varied and heterogeneous. For example, since the 19th century, there has been a streak in Zionism which has been permanent. And one of the major representatives has been Ahad Ha'am in the 19th century, who came to Jaffa in 1892 and was horrified by the way Jewish settlers and their Ottoman authority at the time were treating Palestinian peasants. And another major person in the 20th century was Martin Buber. So would you please elaborate on this streak or dimension of Zionism, which is somewhat unknown, although it is significant in Zionist literature?
This is not a full accusation, but I'll elaborate more on it tomorrow, when I have more time in my life.
It's fine, okay.
But I'll, of course, say something about it now. And as you probably know, that kind of emphasis, which I and others call humanitarian Zionism, I paid a good deal of attention to, and I've written a very long, I hope, scholarly article I wrote it some time ago that deals with that, and deals specifically with Ahad,
Martin Buber, and with Judah Magnus, the first president of the Hebrew University, who, with Martin Buber, espoused this. But the point is this, well, just let me tell you that when I ended that long essay, what I pointed out at the end was not only that this humanitarian emphasis, which was far different than the kind of political Zionism that won the day, not only did it lose in the end, but my argument was that from the beginning of the 20th century on, it never really had a chance. That is to say, it was there, but it was the political Zionism that was concretized, as you know, by Theodor Herzl in the 1890s, and then developed in the 20th century, and developed from just an ideology or a philosophy into a movement. That political Zionism really became Zionism pragmatically. By the time we have come through the Holocaust, and we've come into the early 1940s, well, there was still some small conflict between, let us say, this humanitarian Zionism and political Zionism, but there wasn't much of a conflict. And by the time we come to the end of World War II, it was very hard to find people who were the advocates of the Ahad Ha'am, Martin Buber, Judah Magnus approach. And then the State of Israel came into existence. And when I say that the character of the State of Israel is a Zionist character, I mean, of course, specifically, that character is the political Zionist character that comes from what was emphasized by Theodor Herzl, which is based upon a not very complicated absolute theory of anti-Semitism. An absolute theory, not one I accept, but an absolute theory, which goes like this. Jews have been in the past, and or are being in the present, and or will be in the future, past, present, future. They will be persecuted by non-Jews in all nation states in which they are a minority. Therefore and thereby, Jews need a nation state of their own. Not necessarily a religious state, because Martin Buber was not religious at all. But Jews need a nation state of their own, where they start out as the majority, hopefully of the residents, if not of the residents, then of the citizens who control the state, and they maintain themselves as the majority. Now, the State of Israel came into existence. This is the philosophy upon which the state came into existence. This is the philosophy that has been legislated into the character of the state. So, there are laws then that grant certain rights and privileges to Jews and to Jewish citizens, not granted to non-Jews, as I said. One of them is a right of citizenship. Non-Jews may become citizens, but it's very difficult. They have to apply. The government of Israel restricts that number. With Palestinians, it's varied some in terms of children, but the numbers are still restricted. There's no restriction for Jews. That way, the government can maintain an absolute Jewish majority. There are literally, as you know, tens of these kinds of laws. Let me just briefly mention one other law. By law, in the state of Israel, that is Israel behind the green lines, before 1967 borders. In the expanded borders, it's even a worse story in many ways. But behind the green line, by law, 92.5% of all the arable farmland cannot be sold, rented, or leased to non-Jews by law. Is that what it says? Not exactly. What it says is Jewish National Fund land cannot be sold, rented, or leased to non-Jews. 92.5% of the arable farmland in the state of Israel has been designated by the Israeli government as Jewish National Fund land. Now, I, of course, could go on and on. These are specific indications, again, that it's this political Zionism that stemmed from Theodor Herzl. That, when he concretized it, it's that political Zionism that really has become Zionism, the emphasis that was called humanitarian Zionism, something quite different, which called for a binational state. By the time, again, we've come at least to the mid-20th century, it's as though it almost never existed.
My name is Roger Wannenberg. I'm from London, England. My question, Norton, is that you could have answered the first question is in the following way. You could have said if the United States stopped supporting Israel economically, the state could not exist any further. So my question is this: why does the United States support Israel? It's not obvious. You would think that it was in the interests of a great hegemonic power who wanted the oil of the Middle East and therefore wanted the support of the Arab people of the Middle East, not to support Israel. So it seems to be not an obvious question at all why the United States should support this country.
No, Roger, it's not an obvious question. My good colleagues here are asking me questions that should take hours to answer. So I'll try to do the best I can, and again, I'll give you the beginning same answer I gave Ibrahim. I'll talk a little more about that tomorrow, when hopefully I have a little more time, right? It's quite a good question. I don't know, nor do I necessarily think, as do some people, that the state of Israel would collapse if the United States quit supporting it, Nor do I think that it's realistic at all to think that the United States government is not going to continue to support the state of Israel. I think it might be a possibility that the United States government, I'm not optimistic about this possibility at all, but it might be a possibility that the United States government could change its position some and not continue to support Israel to the extent that it has supported Israel in the past. And would that hinder the Israelis? It would clearly hinder the Israelis. But then to the essence of your question of why has the support been there? Almost blindly, politically, militarily, economically. I'll try to specify that in my lecture tomorrow. I probably don't need to specify that very much for those around this table, but I'll do it anyway, almost blindly, from one administration through another, whether it's a Republican administration and a Republican Congress or a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress. Support that was expanded tremendously after the 1967 war. The question is why. There are two major answers given, or two major theories. One of them is one that I'm sure you know about here and have heard about. You've heard about both of them. But one of them is that Israel is considered to be, has been considered to be, is supported as an outpost of the United States in the Middle East. That is, if the United States can count upon Israel at any time, and that's why it's been supported. This is the argument. You can make quite a good case for this, and this is the argument that's put, for example, by someone I think very highly of, Noam Chomsky. That's his major argument.